A few words first about Malcolm. When he arrived to give that speech, which he did in Britain, there was very little understanding of racism or even that it was going to be a big problem. There'd been riots in Notting Hill Gate, at that time quite a poor area in London, today one of the poshest, very gentrified. There had been an election campaign in 1964, just before Malcolm arrived, in which for the first time we saw a conservative candidate in a seat in the English Midlands trying to defeat the Labour Party with the slogan, "If you want a nigger neighbour, vote Labour." This was the period in which Malcolm arrived in Britain, so there was a great deal of interest. And there was a great deal of slander in the press. Someone who preaches hate has arrived, he's been invited to speak at the Oxford Union, what is he going to do or say? And the BBC, of course, televised that debate, which had a huge impact. And that was the first time people got an idea of who he was, and not just who he was, because he didn't speak about himself, but of what the problem was in the United States and how it could be solved and sorted out. It was a very educative speech, and people really understood. And it was, as Malcolm said to me in a discussion we had for about 2 hours after his speech, he said, "They're going to kill me now. I don't think I'll last that long, because what they hate is the thought of a black person such as myself reaching a stage where we propose unity of black people and white people and whatever people to achieve common goals. That they won't tolerate," he said. That is what poses a threat. In order to try and explain this historically, I think it's vital to go back a bit and to say what happens. It's not the case, and it never is the case, that political consciousness develops in a linear fashion. There are always waves of it. So what we have after every revolutionary wave in upheaval, usually a counter-revolutionary wave, which doesn't always take away everything that has been achieved, but does take away quite a lot. And you can look at it systematically if you look at the English and French revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, which transformed Europe and transformed political consciousness in the world, because the examples created spread all over, as did, though to a lesser extent on a global scale, the American Revolution. Or you can see the impact of the Haitian Revolution, of the French Revolution on the slave island of Haiti, where it triggered off an incredible revolutionary wave, a slave uprising, which created the first black independent republic in the Americas. And after all these revolutions, there came a period of reflux, a long transition, which encompassed reaction, which encompassed revenge against the former victors of the revolution. And this went on in France for quite some time. Then, of course, in the 20th century, we had two big revolutions and a small one. The Russian Revolution of 1917, the Chinese Revolution of 1949, and the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And all these revolutions left a huge impact globally, much more so than the revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries. The world was different now. And, you know, the struggles for decolonization in Africa, in Asia, were made possible by these revolutionary triumphs. And decolonization happened precisely because there was fear on the part of many imperial powers. We tend to forget that today because history has moved on, but one shouldn't forget it. And that is the period in which the struggles for black liberation sprang up in this country too in a mass way. People were watching what was going on. And Malcolm in particular, but not him alone, others too, Richard Wright, the novelist, to give one example, followed what was going on in that world very closely, because they saw this, however much at a distance it was, as a potential help, or as a development that created a space in which they could move and argue. The Russian Revolution, or its aftermath, finally came to an end in 1990. The Chinese Revolution came to an end in 1985, 86, at least that's when the decline started, in 1989, when it embraced capitalism. So after this collapse of 1989 and 1990, we have been living in a period of transition which is marked by two key facts which we cannot ignore. One, for the first time in the history of humanity, we have a single dominant imperial power, that is the United States of America. This has never happened before. I don't think there will be anything else like it. And so that is the period we're living through. One, the global reach, the global imperial reach of the United States, economically variable, militarily, ideologically extremely strong. Second, a globe in which capitalism for the first time has taken grip of each continent, of most of the large countries, with little Cuba holding out, but who knows for how long. What has happened in terms of opposition and radicalism? It has been episodic, it has been regional, it has not been global. If you look at it continentally, since the defeat of the apartheid system in South Africa, the continent has by and large succumbed to chaos, not caused by itself, but caused by the system, the new economic system within capitalism created by the victorious power and its allies, what we call neoliberalism, the Chicago School, call it what you like. And this system they created because they no longer had any need to pretend that an opposition existed or that there was an alternative. The existence of Russia, China, Eastern Europe, that whole power bloc, and its economic system meant that they had to provide some degree of social provision to their own people, and to quite a large extent in Europe and even in this country, in order to show we can do it, but we're Democrats too. We're a democratic system. With the collapse of that world, the economic system shifted, large-scale deregulation, large-scale privatizations, the beginning of a collapse of a social infrastructure, everything dominated by money. The sound of money became dominant, and consumerism virtually dominated everything, including politics. No one knew where this long transition was leading to. And we still don't know. We are not 100% sure. But then a number of things happened. Two important developments took place. The continent where neoliberal economics had first been tried out, and tried out quite brutally, South America. Chile was the first experiment economically of the Chicago School, backed by a military dictatorship. Other countries in South America followed suit. The experiment didn't work, and this created, in different parts of South America, mass movements against deregulation, against privatization, against the Washington Consensus, against the demands of the IMF. And these mass movements were the first sign that something was bubbling away. And when these mass movements created political organizations and political movements who challenged the rulers of the country, not with arms, not with the bullet, but through the ballot, and began to win, panic set in. They challenged its neoliberal version. And what they did was what left social democracy had done in Europe after the Second World War. They said, we want to build schools for our kids, free university education, free medicine and free hospitals, heavily subsidized housing. That's what we want. These were their 3-4 key demands. And we're not going to let the North Americans, the US, tell us what to do. Once again, movements which do not challenge capital as such, but challenge the right of capital to dominate politics. And they say that this capital must be regulated, and the politicians, the elected politicians, and not the bankers must be in charge. And there were some alternatives, albeit within the system, that were emerging. And then happened the big crash of 2008. The Wall Street crash, which triggered off a crisis of the global capitalist system, in Europe particularly, which they haven't got over as yet, and which is crushing the small countries of Europe and creating a huge crisis for the European Union. And it's the combination of all these events that is now creating a new consciousness, especially amongst younger generations. We had elements of that in the United States with the Occupy movements, which was the beginning. The second thing I want to talk about is this. It's that people who don't live here, and that includes myself, do not fully grasp and understand the depths of racism, really. It's very difficult for us to understand that unless you live here. I know many people who live here don't understand it either, but quite a few do. And so I fully understood, even I fully understood, that Obama's victory was a big deal for the African American population. Simply to have a mixed-race president in the White House, married to a black woman, with their kids. I mean, that the symbolism of that went very deep. And that's something, of course, that I understood very well. But it was at the same time, I thought, soon afterwards, the most inventive apparition of the American imperial state. What more could they ask for? Had a big impact on the world. And what people in their enthusiasm and in their joy that this had happened, and inspired by Obama's flights of oratory, felt that something might change. But in fact, to be brutally honest, very little changed, apart from the fact that for the first time there wasn't a white family in the White House. But in terms of American military policy, in terms of America's imperial policies, in terms of US policies in this country, it's not that, it's very little changed, so much so that Obama's predecessor, widely hated here and abroad, could, in a big public press conference in New Delhi in India, when asked by a journalist, what do you think of Obama? He said, I agree with every single thing he's doing. He's continuing my policies on most fronts. Even on the contentious issue of healthcare or Obamacare or whatever, when there were possibilities in the first 100 days to push through a much more radical health program, one that had been a dream of Richard Nixon, no less. And I often say that were Obama to show one spark, now that he's in his last 2 years before someone else takes over, if he wanted to do something that would really be meaningful, he could, as presidents have the right in this country, in their last days in power, to transform the lives of some individuals by pardoning them. Just imagine, were Obama to stand up and say, I'm using that prerogative to pardon the bulk of the young blacks incarcerated in the prison system for no bloody rhyme or reason, except that they had one offense or two offenses. Where is the radicalism within the African American movement, population in this country, which was so strong at the time of Malcolm and Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers? What has happened to it? Well, what has happened to it is what has happened to many other radical movements. That's what I want to stress. It's not an issue or here particularly of race or color, is that many radical movements after the 90s collapsed. Huge communist parties in Italy and France, smaller groups of radical groups who'd been very dominant in the 70s and 80s, they all collapsed. And some of their most prominent leaders actually joined the other side. And what I always found quite entertaining was that many of them, Maoists, Trotskyists, Orthodox communists, Stalinists, took their sectarian style to the other side. So they defended capitalism with the same vigor and same sectarian fervor as they used to defend the struggles against it. Some of the worst defenders of this in Europe certainly were members of far-left groups. And in the Arab world, there's another similar development. Here they didn't go to the other side. But if you look in Algeria, if you look in Egypt, if you look in Pakistan, many of the leaders of the left movements, Maoists, communists, moved towards Islam. So the Muslim Brotherhood in the 80s, some of its 3 key young leaders were ex-Maoists. So what will emerge, we don't know. But I think what we can say is that people aren't giving up. One of the more dangerous developments taking place in the world today is not so much these small groups of terrorists, who are of course awful and do horrible things. But there is a tradition of terrorism which has existed in Europe for over 150 years. They were not Muslim terrorists or terrorists of Islamic origin. They were of many different types. So the fact that this has now been made into a central ideological debate, the so-called war on terror, which carries on and which is now affecting the world of ideas as well, that to explain why these people do it is sometimes considered unacceptable. And it's extremely foolish to operate like this, because you carry on the cycle of violence. The French example of Charlie Hebdo is a very interesting one, because I repeat to you the words of the man, Henri Roussel, who founded this magazine when it had a name which would have been more appropriate to it in recent years. In the early days, it was called Harakiri. But the magazine was banned because they made fun of General de Gaulle, who was then the president. They made fun of his corpse, and the French government immediately banned it. No question about any freedoms then. So what did this magazine do? Nothing justifies what was done, by the way, but just to try and understand the feeling within minority groups in that country. They carried a continuous campaign against the leading figure in Islam, Islamic history, the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, and publishing the most horrific, vulgar cartoons you can imagine. And they continued with this, and it was provocative. And the guy who founded the magazine, Henri Roussel, described after what happened in a very brave essay in French weekly Le Nouvel Observateur. He said, "I told them, stop it. This is not even funny. Why are you doing it? Do you want to die? Is it that you have a death wish?" And he quotes the editor, Sharp, saying, "I want to die on my feet." Yes. So he says, these guys are dead, and he says, Sharp, you could have died on your own. Why did you have to drag all the others in with you? You're responsible for their deaths as well. Now, this article created a storm. And the editor of the paper who published it said, look, you can't go on about making this an issue of freedom of expression if you want me not to publish the text of the founder of the magazine, who is a regular columnist in my weekly paper. How can I not publish it? What is freedom? So we have this strange debate that the freedom of expression essentially means you can say whatever you like about Muslims, but if you say the same things about Jews, we'll lock you up and charge you under hate crimes. That's what's going on. And these newspapers ask, would you do that about Moses? And, for instance, depict him as a serial rapist because of what's going on in Palestine? They said, no, we wouldn't do that. Well, why? So ultimately, it's a question not of the freedom of expression, but of politics, and what your politics are. So there's a huge contradiction between the official ideology of the state and what it practices concretely that creates real and huge problems. It's like here, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for this, when people here knew exactly, especially within the African American communities, what was going on. I remember very well speaking in Berlin in 1967, January, at a huge rally against the war in Vietnam. And really, I'll never forget it. I was proud. There were 3 ex-black GIs on the platform with me. And they stood up and they spoke, and then they all came and they raised their fists and said, "Hell no, I ain't gonna go. I'm not going to go to Vietnam because Vietnam is where I am," meaning in the United States of America. The Iraq War was not covered as the Vietnam War was covered. Libya, you don't even know anything about what happened there. 6 months of NATO bombing, between 20 and 30,000 people killed, and the result, these stupid neoliberal technocrats taken from Texas or Qatar or one of these other Gulf states and put into power couldn't handle it. How could they? They didn't know the country. And the minute the tribal leaders who had opposed Gaddafi saw what they were getting, they said, "No way." So they broke loose, and now you have a nightmare situation where Tripoli, the capital, is controlled by Al-Qaeda, another chunk of Libya is controlled by ISIS, and a third chunk by another religious group which fights with both the others. Big victory, big triumph. In Iraq, you back the Shia clerical parties to come to power. They did in Iraq what has not been done in any previous war. It's not just the oil. You know, people say it's the oil. It's a sort of reductionist argument as far as I'm concerned. No one stopped anyone getting the oil. Even Saddam Hussein was selling oil, despite the sanctions, to any country that wanted it. It was an assertion of raw power, of hegemony, saying we can do this, and in order to get A or B, you have to go through us. And it was a shot across the bows of the Chinese saying, you may be doing well economically, we've let you do that, but don't go beyond that. Don't think you can ever challenge us. And of course, this has now created a world of great disorder, especially in the Arab world. These monstrous creations are the result of that. They haven't fallen. They're not thunderbolts from a clear blue sky. They're the concrete manifestation of imperial policies in that region since the huge triumph of capital in the late 1990s. So that is the world we are living in. This is the world in which we have to fight. You can't fight in the same old ways, but effectively, the struggle remains the same. And I always say this abroad, because I don't need to say it here, but when I travel in different parts of the world, that there is no power on earth that can defeat the United States militarily. Nor does one want there to be perfectly frank with you, because God knows what the result of that would be. But the only people who can change things and who are incredibly important in bringing about that change are the citizens of the United States itself. They're the ones who'll have to do it, all of you, and of course, millions and millions of others. So I hope one of these days you do it.